Hi, this is Leo Schumann. Welcome to our module on working with calendars and events. So in this module, we're going to learn to implement a multi-display events calendar, meaning a year view, a month, a day, etc. We'll start out by understanding and installing required modules and talk a little bit more about the distinction between a project and a module. We're then going to configure our site for date and event display and see that we only want to enable specific modules that we're actually going to use. We'll then go on to create and configure an event content type that includes a date field, and then create views for our calendars from a set of templates that are also installed with these projects. Last, we'll add and configure a block for calendar display and coordinate its display with the rest of the calendar views. First, let's talk about the underlying modules. So there are calendar and date projects available for Drupal, but the date project, we've been kind of calling these URLs date modules, but that's not truly accurate because oftentimes what we're installing is actually a series of modules that could be enabled independently. We'll also separately install the calendar project and ultimately create a multiple view event calendar. Now, we're going to look through the configuration settings that would be relevant here. There are additional modules that can be optionally enabled when you install the date project, including the date all day module, the date pop-up module if you want to have a pop-up calendar, a date repeat module to support multi-day events, and there's many more as well. We'll be taking a look at what the available modules are, but also, you need to know you only want to enable modules you're actually going to use. The date project is actually well written in that it is so granular in the functionality that you can enable. All enabled modules are cached and loaded into memory, and so they do, on some level, impact the overhead of your application. You only want to enable modules you're actually going to use. So as for locale settings, the locale settings control things such as your country, first day of the week, time zone, whether users can set their own time zone, whether they should be reminded to or not, as well as the default time zone and whether or not they can set their time zone at registration. Separately, we're going to look at date types and formats. Now, long, medium, and short date formats get configured as part of core Drupal, and we can use the drop-down to select from dozens of different formats for each of these three types. However, we'll also see that, if necessary, an additional date format could be added. It's actually done by configuring a PHP date object, so we'll take a quick look at where you would find the documentation on how to do that. Let's jump in and get started creating our events calendar. So first, I'm going to install the date project. So go out to drupal.org/project/date, and then I'm going to copy the link address for the particular release version I want to install. Now, early in the course, we had also downloaded the file and installed it locally, and when you go to install a new module, that may well be the way that you do it, is to install it from the local file system for security reasons. But it's worth knowing, at least in test scenarios, you can just point to the URL of an archive for a project and install that way. Then I'm going to install another module immediately. I'll go to the calendar project, copy the link address, and then go back and install from this URL. Now that these are installed, I'll go to enable them. And the first thing I'm going to enable is actually the calendar, although you'll see that it requires the date API module, which is part of the date project, as well as date views. I'll go ahead and enable that. Next, I'll use my filter list. Let's take a look at the available date modules. Date and Date API are already installed because they were required directly by calendar. But I also want to support all-day events and I want to use pop-up calendars in my date fields, and I also want to support a date repeat field, which will also require the underlying date repeat API. So with those selected, I'll save my configuration. We'll work with those in a later lesson. Next, I'm going to go to my configuration, scroll down to my regional and language settings, and under regional settings, I'll configure my default country as the United States, and I'll leave the first day of the week setting, and I'll set my default time zone for a location that's relevant, Vancouver, British Columbia, which is in the same time zone. So I'll select that, and I'll let users set their own time zone and even remind them to do so. And I'm going to say they can set their time zone directly at registration and save this configuration. Then I'm going to go back to my regional and language settings using the breadcrumb here. And then I'll go to my date and time settings, and I'm going to choose a Euro date format using 24-hour time and beginning with date followed by month. And I'll choose that consistently for my short, medium, and long, where I have the date and then month. I'll save that configuration, and then also note here in the upper right hand corner, I could add an additional date format if those long lists weren't sufficient for me. And just note that when you're adding a date format, you can go to the PHP manual and see all of the parameters and documentation on how you would define a date format for Drupal.